Her bravery was inspirational, extraordinary. She received the George Cross. She would never accept any recognition for her special contribution without reminding us that she was the face of a much wider body of operation.
Princess and didn't just step back. She deliberately passed the invisible crown of family matriarch to Catherine and left Camilla standing in the shadow of a decision no one saw coming. I end the private apartments of Windsor Castle, where decisions that shape the monarchy are made away from cameras and crowds. Princess stood before her family with a sealed document that carried no constitutional weight, yet altered the emotional architecture of the royal household forever. She had spent her life refusing the spotlight, even as she performed more public duties than almost any other member of the family. Now, in what she had already decided would be one of her final formal acts, she was about to name the woman the family would turn to when rank and protocol proved insufficient. The room was silent as she broke the seal. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, did not move. Charles watched his sister with the careful stillness of a man who understood that some transfers of trust cannot be undone. Camilla's hands tightened in her lap. William's eyes stayed on his wife, and had carried the burden of being the family's internal compass for decades. When courtiers hesitated, she spoke plainly. When emotions threatened to override duty, she enforced discipline without cruelty. She had protected the institution through the aftermath of Diana's death, through the divorces that followed, through the death of her own mother, and through her brother's cancer diagnosis and treatment. She had done it without ever demanding recognition or position. The role she now prepared to pass on was never about power in the formal sense. It was about the person to whom fractured branches of the family could still look when loyalty to the crown alone was no longer enough to keep them aligned. The document in red described no new title and granted no legal authority. It simply recorded a private settlement reached after months of quiet observation and difficult conversations. Queen Elizabeth II's own papers had contained guidance on the qualities required of the woman who would one day hold the family center: patience under scrutiny, restraint when provoked, and the courage to place the well-being of the next generation above personal grievance. And had tested those qualities in Catherine over time, watching how she responded when palace factions tried to use the children as leverage, how she protected George, Charlotte, and Louis from being turned into symbols before they were ready, and how she absorbed public pressure without allowing it to harden into resentment. The choice had been made long before the paper was placed on the table. Camilla had every reason to feel the ground shift beneath her. Marriage had given her the formal position of queen consort, yet the declaration placed the family's emotional confidence elsewhere. She had endured years of public hostility to stand beside Charles. She had accepted that her path to acceptance would always be complicated. What she had not expected was that the very loyalty she had shown the king would not automatically translate into the trust required to hold the wider family together during a generational transition. When in finished reading, Camilla did not protest. She simply asked why she had not been shown the final wording earlier. Charles had no answer that could satisfy her without diminishing the judgment his sister had exercised. Catherine listened without visible triumph. She understood that the position being offered carried a cost she could not yet measure. Every future disagreement inside the family would now be examined for signs of a power struggle. Every decision she made about her children would be weighed against the expectations of those who believed the matriarch's role gave her authority over households that were not her own. She had never sought influence for its own sake. That was precisely why Anne had chosen her. Unwanted responsibility can still wound the people caught in its wake, and Catherine had already seen how quickly affection could curdle into suspicion when one woman appeared to rise at another's expense. The brooch fastened to Catherine's coat had belonged to Queen Elizabeth II. It was not a crown or a state jewel. It was a private emblem the late queen had set aside years earlier for the woman, who would eventually be asked to preserve warmth inside an institution that often demanded its members choose between personal feeling and public duty. Catherine lowered her eyes as the clasp closed. She did not see the gesture as victory. She saw it as inheritance of every unresolved fracture the family had carried since Diana's death and the departures that followed. William watched his wife's hands remain still, and understood that the woman he loved had just accepted a burden that would test her in ways no public role had yet required. In the weeks that followed, The palace behaved as though something fundamental had changed even though nothing official had been announced. Briefing papers were rerouted. Invitations that once passed through Clarence House now reached Kensington Palace first. Staff who had spent years navigating the careful balance between the king's household and the Wales household began to read the new arrangement as a verdict. Catherine noticed a shift in how people addressed her, and how quickly some sought her opinion on matters that had previously been settled elsewhere. She asked William whether loyalty or fear was driving the change. He told her it was both, and that the distinction would matter more as time passed. Camilla absorbed the same signals from the opposite direction. Her name disappeared from circulation lists for family welfare briefings concerning the children before Charles ordered it restored. She did not want authority returned as a favor. She wanted the household to recognize her position without being instructed to do so. The humiliation was quiet but precise. Catherine, seeing the same pattern, made her first private decision as the woman now expected to hold the center. She asked to speak with Camilla alone after the family's next public appearance. When the door closed, she removed the brooch and placed it on the table between them. She told the queen that she had never requested the declaration and would not allow it to become a weapon. One ceremony could not erase decades of service or the personal cost Camilla had paid to stand beside Charles. Trust, Catherine said, could not be commanded through rank. It could only be earned by refusing to let another woman's pain become the price of one's own position. Camilla listened. For the first time since the declaration had been read, she spoke about what it had cost her to believe that loyalty to the king would eventually secure her place in the family's affections. She had accepted that public acceptance would always be partial. She had not been prepared for the institution itself to signal that belonging and being trusted were not the same thing. Catherine did not offer false comfort. She simply repeated that the family could not heal while affection was treated as a prize only one woman could hold. Then she asked Camilla to fasten the brooch onto her own coat before they appeared together that afternoon. The queen hesitated, then lifted the jewel. Her fingers trembled slightly as she secured the clasp. No bitterness disappeared in that moment, but something harder and more useful took its place. The decision not to let private pain become public destruction, and watch the two women emerge side by side with Charles and William. She had spent her life becoming the person the family turned to when politeness failed. She had settled disputes, protected tradition, and confronted problems before they became crises the public could exploit. Now she was stepping away, not because her judgment had failed, but because she understood that the next phase required a different kind of center. Catherine had protected the children without teaching them to resent the crown. She had absorbed pressure without returning it as cruelty. She had refused to let the declaration isolate the woman most wounded by it. That was the proof and had needed. The public saw only the photograph that escaped the castle grounds. Anne's hand near the brooch, Catherine's wet eyes, Camilla seated a few feet away. Commentators interpreted the image as a verdict on who had won and who had lost. Catherine switched off the coverage. She told William that the family could not allow the public to honor one woman by diminishing another. The real work, she said, would happen in the conversations no camera would ever record. And, listening from another room, allowed herself the smallest nod of satisfaction. She had completed the duty she could not have delegated. The monarchy's future would not be secured by the person who claimed the most visible power. It would be secured by the person willing to use whatever influence she had to make room for others inside the same circle. The era defined by Anne's particular form of steady, often invisible service had reached its natural close. The era that followed would be shaped by Catherine's understanding that mercy and discipline are not opposites but necessary partners. One royal chapter ended with the quiet dignity of a woman who had never asked for recognition. Another began with the quieter courage of a woman who had accepted responsibility without allowing it to harden into exclusion. The balance inside the family had shifted, not through proclamation or ceremony, but through the oldest mechanism the monarchy possesses, the gradual recognition by those who must live with the consequences of who can be trusted when everything else has been stripped away. After the brooch was fastened and the two women stood together, the weight of what had transpired began to settle not just on Catherine and Camilla, but across every corner of the royal household, and retreated to a quieter room where her brother Edward waited, Sensing that her silence was not one of relief, but a profound finality, she confessed that passing the burden felt like abandoning a post she had guarded for most of her adult life. Edward reminded her that choosing a successor was an act of wisdom, not weakness. Yet Anne's gaze lingered on the empty chair that had once belonged to their mother. Grief, long held at bay by relentless duty, arrived the moment her responsibilities lightened. She had mourned Queen Elizabeth as a daughter, while simultaneously serving as the family's anchor. Now, with Catherine stepping into that space, and allowed herself to feel the full measure of what she had carried alone. Catherine, meanwhile, found William away from the formal gathering. She confessed that every future disagreement would now be interpreted as a struggle for dominance. William reassured her that she had been chosen precisely because she never chased influence for its own sake. Still, she shook her head, replying that unwanted power could still hurt those caught in its orbit. Courtiers already watched her expressions as though each glance carried official policy. William understood that the appointment strengthened their branch of the family, but it also placed his wife squarely in the path of old resentments and new expectations. He became fiercely protective, reminding household officials that Catherine's influence must stem from genuine trust, never from a rival power structure operating in her name. For Camilla, the resentment simmered beneath a carefully maintained composure. She had endured decades of public hostility and private sacrifice to stand beside Charles. The declaration felt like confirmation that institutional recognition and familial trust were two entirely different things. Charles saw her pain and tried to balance his roles as husband, king, and father who knew the crown would one day pass to William. He signed the document with a private condition that Catherine's authority remain moral and familial, never constitutional. Yet words on paper could not erase the human cost. Camilla approached Catherine in a private corridor later that day. Her congratulations were sincere, but laced with the quiet question of what came next. Catherine held her gaze and answered simply that she would begin by listening. In that exchange, neither woman looked away. It marked the beginning of a fragile but necessary reconciliation.